Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the front of the massive lecture hall on Centauri. Prime the auditorium could hold 3,000 beings from across the galaxy. Today it was packed. Scientists, military officers, and government officials from dozens of different worlds had come to hear her speak. Most of them were here to laugh at her. Alina looked out at the crowd. She could see the tall, blue-skinned Arcturians in their flowing robes. The insect-like Veltar clicked their mandibles together in what she knew was their version of mocking laughter. The massive, bear-like Ursath delegates sat with their arms crossed, looking bored already. The back she could spot the graceful ethereals floating slightly above their seats, their translucent forms shimmering with what could only be amusement. She had spent 5 years working on this research. 5 years studying every species in the galactic hegemony. 5 years running simulation after simulation. The results always came out the same way, and nobody wanted to believe them. Alina pressed the button on her remote. The first slide appeared on the giant holographic display behind her. It showed the title of her paper in simple, bold letters: Theoretical Combat Adaptations in Homo sapiens, a Comparative Analysis. A wave of chuckles rolled through the audience. Someone in the middle section made a loud snorting sound. Alina had expected this. Humans were the newest members of the hegemony. They had only made contact with galactic civilization 50 years ago. Most species still saw them as primitive creatures who had barely figured out space travel. "Thank you all for coming today," Alina began, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's sound system. "I know many of you think this research is a waste of time. I know some of you are only here because your supervisors made you come. But I ask you to keep an open mind." She clicked to the next slide, showed a chart comparing the physical abilities of different species. The Thrakari warriors were at the top, with their thick armor plating and natural weapons. The Veltar were high on the list too, with their lightning-fast reflexes and poison stingers. Humans were near the bottom, marked as average in almost every category. Looking at basic physical measurements, humans appear to be one of the weakest species. "In the galaxy," Alina continued, "we are not the strongest. We are not the fastest. We do not have natural armor or weapons. By all logical standards, we should be terrible at warfare." More laughter came from the audience. A Thrakari officer in the front row shook his massive head and whispered something to his companion. Alina could guess what he was saying. The Thrakari had been the hegemony's primary military force for over 200 years. They had never lost a major battle. Alina clicked again. The new slide showed her simulation parameters. However, when I began running combat simulations that included psychological and behavioral factors, the results changed dramatically. The laughter started to die down. Some of the scientists in the audience leaned forward slightly. Alina could see she had at least caught their attention. "I programmed simulations of prolonged conflicts, not single battles, but wars lasting months or years. I included factors like adaptability, learning speed, psychological resilience, and something I call pack bonding behavior." She clicked to show the results. The chart that appeared made the entire auditorium go silent for a moment. In prolonged conflict scenarios, humans were ranked 3rd out of all known species, above the Thrakari, above the Veltar, above species that had been conquering worlds. Since before Earth had developed agriculture, the silence lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the hall erupted in noise. Beings were talking, arguing, and laughing all at once. Several delegates stood up from their seats. Alina could hear phrases being shouted in a dozen different languages. Impossible, flawed data, human propaganda. Alina waited for the noise to die down. It took almost 5 minutes. When the hall was quiet again, she continued as if nothing had happened. "I understand your skepticism," she said. "The results surprised me too. So I ran the simulations again. And again, I changed the parameters. I used different scenarios. I even had colleagues from other worlds check my work. The results were always the same." She clicked to the next slide, which showed specific behavioral patterns. Humans display several traits that are rare in galactic civilization. They form emotional bonds with individuals outside their immediate family groups. They will sacrifice themselves for complete strangers. They adapt their tactics rapidly when faced with new situations. And perhaps most importantly, they do not surrender even when victory appears impossible. A Velter scientist near the front made a clicking sound that Alina recognized as their version of disbelief. "Dr. Vasquez," the alien said, its translator making its voice sound mechanical. "These traits you describe are not advantages. They are signs of mental instability. No rational being sacrifices itself for strangers. A logical military force continues fighting when defeat is certain." Alina nodded. That is exactly what makes humans so dangerous in prolonged conflicts. Other species fight logically. They calculate odds, surrender when the mathematics say they cannot win. Humans often ignore the mathematics entirely. She clicked 2. Show video footage from human historical conflicts. These are records from human military history. In every case shown here, human forces were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Logic said they should have surrendered immediately. Instead, they fought until the last individual was unable to continue. In several cases, these hopeless last stands actually led to strategic victories. The audience was quieter now, but Alina could sense their disbelief. She knew what they were thinking. These were stories from human history, when humans only fought other humans. Surely they would behave differently when faced with superior alien forces. "I know what you are all thinking," Alina said. "You believe humans will act differently when faced with truly superior opponents. My simulations suggest otherwise." Dead. Fact, they suggest that humans fight harder when facing stronger enemies. She clicked to her final slide. It showed casualty projections for a hypothetical war between the hegemony and an unknown enemy force. In scenarios where human forces were the primary military response, hegemony losses were 60% lower than scenarios using traditional Throkery-led forces. My research concludes that human military forces would be far more effective than current hegemony doctrine suggests. I recommend immediate integration of human tactical approaches into our standard military training. The silence that followed was different from before. This was not shock or amusement. This was the silence of beings who were genuinely considering what they had heard, even if they did not want to believe it. Finally, General Korthax of the Thrakari High Command stood up. His massive form cast a shadow over half the front section. When he spoke, his voice boomed through the hall without need for amplification. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, "your research is interesting, but it is still just theory. Simulations and historical data from primitive conflicts cannot predict how humans would perform against real galactic threats. Until these theories are tested in actual combat, they remain nothing more than elaborate propaganda for your species." The general sat down to scattered applause. Alina looked out at the audience one more time. She could see that most of them agreed with the Thrakari. "General, her research was interesting, perhaps, but ultimately meaningless." Alina gathered her notes and stepped away from the podium. She had expected this reaction. She just hoped that when the time came to test her theories, the galaxy would be ready to listen. Commander Velkoth was having his morning meal. When the emergency alert shattered the peaceful silence of his quarters aboard the hegemony flagship Eternal Glory, the high-pitched wail of the battle alarm sent ice through his veins. In his 20 years of service, he had never heard that sound outside of training exercises. He rushed to the command center, still pulling on his uniform jacket. The massive central display showed something that made no sense. The outer sensor grid was detecting ships, thousands of them, but they were not showing up in any of the identification databases. "Report," Velkoth ordered as he took his position at the command station. Lieutenant Zeroth, young Arcturian officer, turned from her console with wide, frightened eyes. "Sir, we have multiple contacts emerging from dark space at the edge of the Kepler system. Initial count is over 3,000 vessels. They are not responding to communication attempts." Velkoth studied the display. The ships were unlike anything he had ever seen. They looked more grown than built, with organic curves and what appeared to be living tissue covering their hulls. As he watched, more ships continued to emerge from the black space between star systems. "Have we identified their species?" asked. "No, sir," Zareth replied. Their ship designs do not match any known galactic civilizations. The computer is calling them unknowns. Within 6 hours, the first reports started coming in from the outer colonies. The unknown ships had attacked the mining station at Proxima 7. The station's distress signal lasted exactly 43 seconds before cutting off completely. When Hegemony patrol ships arrived at the location 12 hours later, they found nothing but empty space and floating debris. The Hegemony Council called an emergency session. Representatives from all member worlds gathered in the Great Assembly Hall on Centauri Prime. The mood was tense but not panicked. After all, the Hegemony had faced hostile species before. They had always won. General Korthax stood before the assembly with his usual confidence. His massive Thrakri frame made the podium look small. Council members, he began, his voice echoing through the hall, we face an unknown enemy. But we have faced unknowns before. Our military forces are the strongest in the galaxy. We will crush these invaders just as we have crushed all who came before them. The council erupted in approving roars and clicks and chirps from dozens of different species. The Thrakari had never been defeated. Their shock troops were legends throughout the galaxy. Their tactics had been perfected over centuries of warfare. Whatever these new aliens were, they would learn to fear the might of the Hegemony. The first major battle took place at the industrial world of New Desha. General Korthax led a fleet of 800 ships, including 50 of the massive Thrakari dreadnoughts. The enemy force was roughly equal in number, but intelligence reports suggested their technology was primitive. Their ships had no visible energy weapons, no particle beam arrays, no quantum torpedoes. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, General Korthax was dead. His flagship had been torn apart by some kind of biological weapon that ate through the hull like acid. Of his 800 ships, only 37 managed to escape. The enemy had lost less than 50 vessels. The survivors brought back terrifying reports. The enemy ships were alive. It learned and adapted during the battle itself. When the Thrakari used their famous plasma cannons, the enemy ships grew new armor that resisted plasma. When the Hegemony forces tried their standard flanking maneuvers, the enemy predicted and countered them within minutes. Worse still, the enemy seemed to be some kind of hive mind. They moved with perfect coordination, as if controlled by a single intelligence. When one ship learned something, all the ships immediately knew it too. The news of the defeat sent shockwaves through the Hegemony. The Thrakari had been beaten, not just defeated, but utterly destroyed. It seemed impossible. The enemy, who the intelligence services had started calling the Kethmer Swarm, did not stop to celebrate their victory. They moved immediately to their next target, then their next. World after world fell to their advance. The planet Arcturus, the Veltar, deployed their entire quick-strike fleet. The insect-like warriors were famous for their lightning-fast attacks and deadly precision. They had perfected hit-and-run tactics over thousands of years. They struck the Kethmer fleet and vanished before the enemy could respond. Or so they thought. The Kethmer had learned from their previous battles. They had grown new sensory organs that could track the Veltar ships, even when they used their cloaking technology. What should have been a quick strike became a massacre. The entire Veltar fleet was wiped out in less than 2 hours. The Ethereals tried a different approach. They used their advanced psychic abilities to attack the minds of the Kethmar. For a brief moment, it seemed to work. Several enemy ships stopped moving, floating dead in space. Then something terrible happened. The Kethmer adapted to the psychic attacks and somehow turned them back on the Ethereals. The psychic feedback killed every Ethereal in the attacking fleet instantly. Within 3 months, the Kethmer had conquered 7 worlds and destroyed 4 major fleets. Every tactic the Hegemony tried failed. Every weapon system they deployed was countered. The enemy learned faster than the Hegemony could adapt. Panic began to spread through the galaxy. Refugee ships filled with survivors from conquered worlds clogged the space lanes. Planets on the edge of Hegemony space started preparing their own defenses, not trusting the military to protect them. The Hegemony Council met in emergency session again. This time, the mood was very different. Fear had replaced confidence. Representatives whispered among themselves instead of making bold speeches. Chancellor Morden of the High Council stood slowly. Ancient Ethereal looked older than usual, his translucent form flickering with exhaustion. "We have tried everything," he said quietly. "Our best warriors, our strongest fleets, our most advanced tactics. Nothing works against these creatures. They learn too fast. They adapt too quickly." A heavy silence fell over the assembly. No one wanted to speak the words that everyone was thinking. The hegemony was losing. The greatest military force in galactic history was being beaten by an enemy they did not understand. Finally, a small voice spoke from the back of the hall. "What about the human research?" All eyes turned to see who had spoken. It was Dr. Elena Vasquez. She sat in the observers section, her small human form almost invisible among the larger alien delegates. "The human simulation data," she continued, standing slowly. "6 months ago, you all dismissed my research as propaganda. But my simulations were designed to test performance against unknown adaptive enemies. Perhaps it is time to reconsider." Chancellor Morden looked down at her with tired eyes. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, "your people have no real military experience against galactical threats. Your simulations were interesting, but these are real battles with real consequences." Elena nodded. "Yes, Chancellor, real battles that. Your experienced forces are losing. What do you have to lose by trying something different?" The hall fell silent again. Outside, reports were coming in of another hegemony defeat at the world of Rigel 7. The Kethmer swarm was getting closer to the core worlds with each passing day. For the first time in galactic history, the hegemony was running out of options. Admiral Sarah Chen stood on the observation deck of the human battleship Defiance, watching the massive hegemony fleet assembly yards through the reinforced windows. Ships from dozens of worlds were docked there, their crews preparing for what many believed would be the final battle for galactic civilization. 3 weeks had passed since the emergency council session where Elena's research had been mentioned. 3 weeks of desperate debate, political arguments, and military planning. The Kethmer swarm had taken 2 more worlds during that time. They were now only 4 jumps away from Centauri Prime itself. Sarah had been called to the capital with a little explanation. When she arrived, she found herself in the strangest situation of her career. The Hegemony Council, the same beings who had barely acknowledged humanity's existence for 50 years, were asking her to take command of their combined military forces. The meeting had been awkward and painful to watch. Chancellor Morden had struggled to find the right words. The other council members had looked anywhere except at Sarah's face. These proud, ancient civilizations were being forced to ask the newest, smallest member species for help. Admiral Chen, the Chancellor, had finally said, "We find ourselves in an unprecedented situation. Our traditional military approaches have proven ineffective against this new enemy. Dr. Vasquez's research suggests that human tactical thinking might offer advantages we have not considered." Sarah had looked around the room at the assembled representatives. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the fear, the barely hidden shame at having to turn to what they still considered a primitive species. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" she had replied. "Take command of our remaining military forces," Chancellor Morden had answered. "Implement whatever strategies you believe will work against the Kethmer. You will have complete authority over all hegemony military assets." The room had erupted in whispered conversations. Several representatives had looked openly shocked. A Thrakri delegate had stood up and walked out without saying a word. This was the ultimate admission of failure for the galaxy's greatest military powers now. 3 weeks later, Sarah was preparing to lead the largest human military force ever assembled in space. The Earth Defense Force had sent every available ship. The Colonial Marines had deployed their best units. Even the civilian transport companies had volunteered their vessels for conversion to military use. But Sarah knew what the other council members were thinking. They saw this as a desperate gamble, not a real solution. They expected the humans to buy time, maybe slow down the Kethmer advance long enough for someone to think of a better plan. They did not expect victory. The target was Kepler 4 for to be a contested world that the Kethmer had invaded, but not yet fully conquered. Intelligence reports suggested they were using it as a staging area for their next advance toward the core worlds. If the human forces could retake Kepler-4 for 2b, it would cut the enemy supply lines and force them to slow their advance. Sarah's fleet consisted of 230 ships. It was the largest force humanity had ever put together, but it was tiny compared to the fleets that the Thrakkeray and Veltar had led to their defeats. Most of the alien observers expected it to be destroyed within hours of making contact with the enemy. Dr. Alina Vasquez had requested permission to accompany the fleet as a military advisor. Sarah had agreed, partly because Elena's research had made this mission possible, and partly because she valued having another human perspective in the planning sessions. "The other species representatives think we are going to die," Alina said quietly as she joined Sarah on the observation deck. Sarah nodded. "I know. I can see it in their eyes every time we have a planning meeting. They are waiting for us to fail so they can say they tried everything." "Are you worried, Alina?" asked. Sarah considered the question. "About the battle?" "Yes. Any sane person would be worried about fighting an enemy that is never lost. But I am not worried about proving your research wrong. I have been reading the tactical reports from the previous battles. The hegemony forces fought exactly like I expected them to fight." "What do you mean?" "They fought like they were playing a game with rules," Sarah explained. "They used standard formations, standard tactics, standard responses to enemy actions. When the enemy adapted, they tried minor variations of the same approaches. They never did anything truly unexpected." Alina smiled slightly. "And humans do. Not fight by the rules." "Humans barely know what the rules are," Sarah replied. "Most of our soldiers have never seen galactic military doctrine. They're going to fight the way humans have always fought. Messy, unpredictable, and with complete disregard for what the enemy expects them to do." The fleet departed 2 days. Later, as they jumped toward Kepler-4 for to be, Sarah gathered her senior officers for a final briefing. The conference room contained the strangest mix of military personnel in galactic history. Human Marines sat next to Arcturian naval officers. Veltar pilots shared tables with Thrakari engineers. Most of them had never worked together before. "Listen carefully," Sarah began. "Everything you have learned about galactic military tactics, forget it. We are not going to fight this battle the way the hegemony expects us to fight it. We are not going to fight it the way the Kethmar expect us to fight it. We are going to fight it like humans." A Thrakkeray colonel raised his massive hand. "Admiral, with respect, human military history shows a tendency toward chaotic, uncoordinated attacks. Against an enemy as organized as the Kethmar, such tactics would be suicide." Sarah looked at him calmly. "Colonel, how many battles have your organized, coordinated tactics won against the Kethmar?" The Thrackeray's face darkened, but he did not answer. "The enemy learns from every engagement," Sarah continued. "They adapt to whatever we throw at them. So we are not going to throw them anything they can learn from. We are going to be so unpredictable that adaptation becomes impossible." She activated the tactical display. "Here is what we know about the enemy force at Kepler-4 to be. Approximately 1,000 ships, organized in the standard Kethmar High formation. They expect us to attack their flanks or try to break their center. They've adapted to counter both approaches." Sarah highlighted several points on the display. "So we are going to do neither. We're going to split our forces into 12 independent groups. Each group will attack a different target at a different time using different tactics. Some groups will retreat immediately after making contact. Others will fight to the last ship. Some will use conventional weapons. Others will ram enemy vessels directly." The alien officers in the room looked horrified. A Veltar captain spoke up, her translated voice sharp with disbelief. "Admiral, that is not a battle plan. That is chaos." Sarah smiled. "Exactly. The enemy cannot adapt to chaos because there's nothing consistent to adapt to. They cannot predict our next move because we do not know what our next move will be until we make it." She looked around the room at the confused and worried faces. "I know this goes against everything you have been taught about warfare, but everything you have been taught has already failed against this enemy. Trust me. Trust my people. We know how to fight when the odds are impossible." Alina stood up from her seat in the back of the room. "The Admiral is right," she said. Our research showed that humans perform best in exactly these conditions. When victory seems impossible, when the enemy is stronger, when conventional tactics have failed, that is when humans become most dangerous. The fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system 6 hours later. Long-range sensors immediately detected the Kethmer fleet, exactly where intelligence had predicted. 1,000 bioships arranged in perfect formation around the contested planet. Sarah took her position on the bridge of the Defiance. Around her, human and alien crew members prepared for battle. She could feel the tension in the air, the fear and excitement mixing together. "All ships," she announced over the fleet communication system. "Remember what we discussed? Do not try to win this battle. Try to confuse the enemy so badly that they cannot figure out how to beat us. Begin random deployment pattern." The human fleet scattered in 12 different directions, each group heading toward the enemy from a different angle. There was no coordination, no unified strategy, no master plan. This looked like complete chaos. From her command chair, Sarah watched the enemy formation beginning to shift as they tried to respond to the approaching human forces. For the first time since the war began, the Kethmar seemed uncertain. "Let's see how well you adapt to this," she whispered. Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez crouched behind the twisted wreckage of what used to be a Kethmer bioship. His squad of 8 Marines was pinned down on the surface of Kepler 44b, taking heavy fire from enemy ground forces. According to the mission briefing, they were supposed to have been evacuated 2 hours ago, but Sergeant Rodriguez had made a different decision. "Sarge," called out Private Chen, her voice barely audible over the sound of alien weapons fire. "The transport ship is gone. We're stuck here." Rodriguez peered around the edge of their cover. The landscape looked like something from a nightmare. The Kethmer had been changing the planet itself, growing strange organic structures that pulsed with sickly light. Distance. He could see one of their massive hive towers, easily 50 stories tall, and covered with what looked like breathing skin. "Good," Rodriguez replied, checking his weapon. "That means the enemy thinks we're dead. It's time to cause some trouble." This was exactly the kind of situation that confused the alien observers. Any rational military force would have called for rescue. Any logical commander would have tried to minimize casualties by retreating. But Rodriguez was thinking like a human marine, not like a galactic military officer, in space above the planet. Admiral Sarah Chen was watching the battle unfold on her tactical display. It was the strangest engagement in galactic military history. Her 12 groups of ships were attacking the Kethmer fleet from all directions, but not in any way that made sense to traditional military thinking. Group 7 had charged directly at the enemy center, guns blazing, then suddenly turned around and retreated when they were almost in ramming range. Group 3 was flying in circles around a cluster of bioships, firing randomly and making no attempt to form battle lines. Group 12 had split into individual ships that were attacking completely different targets. The Kethmer were trying to adapt to each different approach. But every time they changed their formation to counter one group, another group would do something completely different. Their perfect coordination was becoming a weakness because they could not decide which threat to focus on. "Admiral," reported Commander Hayes from the tactical station, "Group 4 has lost half their ships, but they're still attacking. Group 9 has taken minimal damage because they keep running away before the enemy can target them effectively. Group 1 just rammed 3 bioships and is now fighting with boarding parties." Sarah nodded. This was exactly what she had hoped for. Keep monitoring all groups. Do not give any new orders unless they specifically request assistance. Let each commander make their own decisions. On the bridge of the destroyer, Relentless, Captain Maria Santos was leading Group 4 in what appeared to be a suicide attack. Her ships were flying straight into the heaviest concentration of enemy vessels, taking massive damage but refusing to retreat. "Captain," her weapons officer called out, "we've lost the Portland and the Manchester. The Damascus is venting atmosphere. Should we fall back?" Captain Santos looked at her display. Her group was almost completely surrounded by Kethmer bioships. Any reasonable commander would have ordered a retreat 10 minutes ago. But Santos had grown up reading stories about human military history. She knew about the Battle of Thermopylae, about the Alamo, About Stalingrad. Negative, she replied. All ships continue attack. Make them pay for every meter. The alien crew members on her bridge looked at her with expressions that mixed admiration and terror.
Ow.
They could not understand why she was choosing certain death over tactical withdrawal, but they had volunteered to serve under human command, and they trusted her judgment even when they could not comprehend it. What Santos knew, and what the Kethmer were starting to learn, was that her sacrifice was not meaningless. Every bioship that focused on destroying her group was a ship that could not adapt to the other 11 groups. Her seemingly suicidal attack was actually protecting the rest of the fleet. Back on the planet's surface, Sergeant Rodriguez and his squad had somehow managed to reach the base of the massive hive tower. The structure was even more disturbing up close. The walls pulsed like a heartbeat, and strange fluids leaked from openings that looked like wounds. Sarge, whispered Corporal. Kim, this thing is alive. The whole building is some kind of creature. Rodriguez pulled out his demolition charges. Let's give it indigestion. This was another thing that puzzled the alien observers. Human soldiers showed no fear of the unknown. Where other species would have studied the alien architecture, tried to understand its purpose, or called for specialists, humans simply decided to blow it up. Rodriguez placed charges at what looked like structural weak points. He had no idea if explosives would work against a living building, but he was willing to find out. As his squad prepared to detonate the charges, enemy ground forces discovered their position. Contact, shouted Private Chen, as Kethmer warriors began pouring out of openings in the tower. The aliens looked like a cross between insects and reptiles. With multiple arms ending in razor-sharp claws, the firefight was brutal in close range. Rodriguez watched 2 of his Marines go down before the enemy reached their position. Then the fighting became hand-to-hand combat, something that no galactic military manual had prepared the aliens for. Corporal Kim tackled a Kethmer warrior twice her size, somehow managing to drive her combat knife between its armor plates. Private Johnson grabbed another enemy soldier and threw himself off a ledge, taking the alien with him in what could only be called a tactical suicide. This was what Elena's research had tried to explain to the galactic community. Humans did not just fight to win. They fought with an emotional intensity that other species found incomprehensible. They formed bonds with their teammates that made them willing to die for complete strangers. As the squad fought for their lives, around the base of the hive tower, Rodriguez managed to reach the detonator. Enemy claws raked across his back as he pressed the button. The explosion that followed shook the entire structure in space. Admiral Sarah Chen watched as one of the massive bio-installations on the planet's surface suddenly collapsed. She had no idea which of her ground teams had caused the explosion, but it was having immediate effects on the enemy fleet. Several bioships suddenly stopped moving, as if they had lost communication with the surface. Admiral Commander Hayes reported enemy formation is breaking apart. They're trying to redeploy to protect their ground installations. But our scattered attack pattern is making it impossible for them to coordinate. Sarah smiled grimly. Signal all groups. Continue current attack patterns. Do not let them regroup. What was happening was unprecedented in galactic military history. The Kethmer hive mind, which had been their greatest strength against organized enemies, was becoming confused by the chaotic human tactics. They could not adapt to attacks that had no pattern. They could not predict strategies that changed every few minutes. Group 12, which had been flying in seemingly random directions, suddenly converged on a cluster of bioships that had been isolated from the main fleet. Group 7, which had been retreating for 20 minutes, abruptly reversed course and caught a group of enemy vessels completely off guard. The most confusing part for the Kethmer was that the human commanders kept making decisions that seemed to ignore their own safety. Ships that should have retreated kept fighting. Soldiers who should have called for rescue kept attacking. Units that should have surrendered kept resisting. Captain Santos and the remains of Group 4 were finally overwhelmed after holding the enemy's attention for nearly an hour. As her ship broke apart around her, she managed to send one final message to the fleet. Tell them we held the line. Her sacrifice had allowed Groups 2 and 8 to flank the main enemy formation. Group 5 had used the distraction to rescue the survivors from 3 damaged bioships, including alien crew members who had never expected humans to risk their lives for non-human allies. As the battle entered its 6th hour, something unprecedented happened. The Kethmer fleet began to retreat. For the first time since the war began, the enemy was withdrawing from a fight they could have won through simple mathematics. Admiral Sarah Chen stared at her tactical display in amazement. Her fleet had started with 230 ships. She now had 143 vessels still capable of fighting. By any logical measure, she should have lost this battle hours ago, but the enemy was retreating, and Kepler 442b was no longer under their control. Elena Vasquez, monitoring the battle from the observation deck, felt a mixture of vindication and sadness. Her research had been proven correct, but at a terrible cost in human lives. As she watched the surviving ships regrouping, she wondered if the galaxy would finally understand what she had tried to tell them. 6 months ago, humans did not fight by the rules because they had learned over thousands of years of warfare that the most important victories came when you were willing to break every rule to protect what mattered. 6 months after the Battle of Kepler 442b, Dr. Elena Vasquez stood in the same lecture hall where she had first presented her research. But everything was different now. The auditorium was packed with beings from across the galaxy, just like before, but this time they had come to listen, not to laugh. The front row was filled with military commanders and government officials who hung on her every word. General Thokmer, the new Thrakari military leader, took careful notes on a datapad. Commander Zilineth of the Veltar Quick Strike Forces leaned forward in her seat. Even the ethereals, usually so distant and aloof, had sent their best strategic minds to attend her lecture. Alina looked out at the crowd and remembered the mockery she had faced here just 1 year ago. The same beings who had called her research propaganda now treated her like the most important scientist in the galaxy. It was a strange feeling, being vindicated, but she took no pleasure in having been right about something so terrible. "Ladies, gentlemen, and honored beings," Elena began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "Today I want to talk about what we learned from the Kethmer War, and why humanity's approach to warfare proved effective where traditional methods failed." She clicked to her first slide, showing casualty statistics from the 6-month conflict. The numbers told a stark story. In the first 3 months, before human forces were deployed, the hegemony had lost over 2 million military personnel and 27 worlds. In the second 3 months after humans took command, they had lost only 300,000 troops and had actually retaken 15 worlds. The key difference, Elena continued, was not superior technology or greater numbers. The human fleet was always smaller than traditional hegemony forces. The difference was psychological and tactical unpredictability. A young Arcturian scientist raised her hand. "Dr. Vasquez, can you explain why the Kethmer were unable to adapt to human tactics when they had successfully countered every other species?" Alina smiled. This was exactly the question she had hoped someone would ask. The Kethmer were a hive-mind species. They learned and adapted by identifying patterns in enemy behavior and developing counters to those patterns. Human forces succeeded because they deliberately avoided creating patterns. She clicked to show a tactical analysis of the Battle of Kepler 442b. Look at this engagement. 12 separate groups attacking with 12 different strategies, many of which changed during the battle itself. The enemy could not adapt because there was nothing consistent to adapt to. A Thrakari colonel in the back row stood up. Lena recognized him as one of the officers who had walked out of her original presentation. "Dr. Vasquez," he said slowly, "are you suggesting that chaos is superior to organized military doctrine?" "Not chaos," Alina replied carefully. "Controlled unpredictability. Human forces were not random or disorganized. They were highly trained units making tactical decisions based on immediate circumstances rather than following predetermined strategies." She clicked to the next slide, showing communication records from the battle. Notice how often human commanders made independent decisions without waiting for orders from higher command. Sergeant Rodriguez's squad Captain Santos's sacrifice, the dozen small unit actions that turned the tide of battle. None of these were planned. They were decisions made by individuals in the moment. The hall was completely silent. Alina could see that she had their full attention now. These were military professionals trying to understand how everything they thought they knew about warfare had been proven wrong. But perhaps the most important factor, Alina continued, was something that most galactic species find difficult to understand. Human soldiers fight harder when protecting others than when protecting themselves. She clicked to show video footage from the ground battle on Kepler 44b. The recording showed Private Johnson throwing himself and an enemy off a ledge, sacrificing his own life to protect his squad mates. In another clip, a wounded Marine used his body to shield alien civilians during an evacuation. This behavior appears irrational, Alina explained, but it serves a crucial tactical purpose. When soldiers know that their comrades will sacrifice everything to protect them, they fight with incredible determination. When they know they would do the same for others, they find courage they never knew they had. General Thacmer raised his massive hand. Dr. Vasquez, how do we teach these qualities to non-human forces? How do we train our soldiers to think like humans? Lena had been dreading this question. General, I am not sure you can. These behaviors are not just tactical choices. They are part of human psychology, developed over millions of years of evolution. They cannot be simply copied or taught like a weapon system. The disappointment in the room was obvious. Elena could see military officers exchanging worried glances. They had hoped she would give them a simple solution, a training manual that would turn their forces into human-style fighters. However, Elena continued, there are lessons that can be applied. The most important is to give individual commanders more freedom to make tactical decisions. Stop relying on rigid doctrine. Allow creativity and adaptation at all levels of command. She clicked to her final slide, showing the current state of the galaxy 6 months after the war ended. The Kethmer swarm retreated into dark space after their defeat at the Battle of Rigel Station. Intelligence suggests they have not attacked any other civilizations since then. For the first time in their species' history, they encountered an enemy they could not understand or defeat. Chancellor Morden stood up in the front row. The ancient ethereal looked older than Alina remembered, but his voice was strong. Dr. Vasquez, the Council has asked me to formally request that humanity accept a permanent position in the hegemony military command structure. Will you carry this message to your government? Alina nodded. I will, Chancellor. But I must warn you that humans do not think like other species. If you want us to help defend the galaxy, you will have to accept that we will do it our way, not yours. After what we have witnessed, the Chancellor replied, I believe the galaxy is ready to learn from human methods, however strange they may seem. The lecture ended to thunderous applause. As Alina gathered her notes, beings from dozens of species approached her with questions, requests for interviews, and invitations to speak at their home worlds. The same research that had been dismissed as primitive propaganda was now being hailed as the most important military analysis in galactic history. But Elena's mind was not on her newfound fame. She was thinking about Admiral Sarah Chen, who was now commanding the new combined fleet. She was thinking about the surviving Marines from Kepler 44b, who had become legends throughout the galaxy. She was thinking about Captain Santos and the thousands of other humans who had died, proving that sometimes the most irrational behavior was actually the most rational response to an impossible situation. As she walked out of the lecture, Alina was approached by a young human reporter from Earth News Network. Dr. Vasquez, the reporter asked, how does it feel to be vindicated? To have your research proven correct? Alina stopped and considered the question. It feels terrible, she said quietly. I would much rather have been wrong about everything. Being right meant that thousands of good people had to die to prove a point that should have been obvious from the beginning. She looked back at the lecture hall, where alien military officers were still discussing her presentation. The saddest part is that it took a war to make them listen. Everything I told them today was in my original research. They could have learned these lessons without anyone having to die. The reporter scribbled notes furiously. What's next for you, Dr. Vasquez? Alina smiled slightly. The hegemony has asked me to establish a new research institute. We're going to study every member species and try to understand their unique strengths, not just their obvious physical abilities. Maybe next time the galaxy faces a threat, we won't have to wait until conventional methods fail before we consider alternative approaches. As she walked away, Alina thought about the irony of her situation. She had become the galaxy's leading expert on military psychology by studying her own species. But the most important lesson from the HFY War was not about humans at all. It was about the danger of assumptions, the power of open minds, the fact that sometimes the most valuable insights came from the most unexpected sources. The galaxy would never make the same mistake again. They would never again dismiss a species as primitive without understanding what made them unique. And perhaps most importantly, they would never again assume that there was only one right way to fight for what mattered. Alina had started her research to prove that humans belonged in the galactic community. She had ended up proving that the galactic community had a lot to learn from everyone, including species they had never bothered to understand.